Have we not taken risks before? She asked quietly. Paul simply stared at her, unable to comprehend that she wasn't supporting his argument. Pros and cons, she said, looking around at the others. Weigh up the risks against the benefits. If it's still intact and if it's clear, then we could be in France in the exact vehicle we need with all our supplies in what, an hour? Less? Paul, being the best person qualified to answer the question, cleared his throat. Under 90 minutes, he admitted grudgingly. But there's a bucket load of ifs there. And if, she went on, we find it blocked or full of water, then we find another way. But if we have a chance to get through in one piece and not have to scavenge vehicles and food and supplies on the other side, then we need to take it. Simon still sat wearing an amused smile as he watched the play unfold. He knew there was a chance of a collapse. But he also knew how hard it would be to find a vehicle anywhere near as capable and well-equipped as the Land Rover Dan had given him. It was perfect for the journey they faced, other than that it couldn't float, and finding a replacement would be next to impossible. "Sounds like a plan to me," Simon said happily. Exasperated, Paul sat back heavily and made no show of hiding his annoyance at their engineering ignorance. Chris stayed quiet after having been embarrassed by Paul's rant and the subsequent argument. "Then let's do it," Lexi said as she rose. "I don't want to go," came a small voice. It came as no major surprise to Lexi, but the others stared at Melissa in shock. Chris was the first to speak. "Why?" he asked, fumbling for more words. It was clear to both Paul and Lexi that he liked Melissa being around him, and ever since Anna had turned away from Chris after the stillbirth, he had spent longer hours at the farm and subsequently more time with Melissa. "Look at me," she said tiredly and with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm no adventurer. I don't like carrying a gun with me everywhere. I just want to be safe and sleep at night." She turned her smile towards Chris, telling those watching that she knew the real reason he wanted her to come. "You could stay too, you know," she said softly. "No," he said angrily, then let out a breath and seemed to shrink a little. "No," he said again more gently. "I want to look Dan in the face and tell him everything. I want to describe the crash to him. I want him to know what it felt like to lose our home. If I can do that and come back, then I will." He picked up his rifle awkwardly and walked away. Lexi and Paul followed at a respectable distance to talk to him, leaving Simon and Melissa alone. "Why don't you want to go?" she asked him in a subdued but curious tone. Simon took a long breath to give him time to consider his answer. In truth, he found it too difficult to look people in the eyes when he alone of their loved ones returned from the expedition. His account of what had happened on the coast had holes too many holes in fact, and he suspected that the rest of the group knew he was hiding something, that he was concealing a cold-blooded murder of one of their own, as traitorous and evil as he was, and that heavy burden was portrayed as secrecy. He had lost their trust and had gained their suspicion, and that made for a lonely life. He fixed the girl with a lopsided smile. "Nobody will miss me here," he said sadly. "And I have a slate to wipe clean." At one with nature. After the brief scare of Marie fainting and the desperately frayed nerves of everyone in their debilitated convoy, Dan reluctantly ceded to the demands of others to find a place to rest. Sarah's hostility was softened by Kate's genuine plea that they could not continue as they were, and that was her medical opinion. In truth, Dan took very little convincing that it was the right thing to do, but the questions of where and how long for were his major concerns. To pick an unsafe or undependable position was to endanger the lives of everyone. To delay too long could jeopardize the lives of Marie and their baby. Where they were would have to suffice for the night. Another argument with Sarah about moving Marie was an unwelcome prospect. Calling in Adam and Mitch to join Leah, Neil, and himself, he laid out the proposal in the safety provided by Jack and Jimmy keeping watch at either end of the stationary convoy. "We need a temporary site," he announced in hushed tones away from inquisitive ears. "Somewhere for a week's rest that can be defended." He let that sink in as he arched his back and was rewarded with a sickening crack of compressed vertebrae. Ignoring the disgusted look on Leah's face, he continued. "At first light, I want you two," he said, pointing at Mitch and Neil, "to take the bikes and find the nearest place." The two men he chose were perfect for the task, as one would consider the group's needs and comfort while the other would assess it from an attacker's point of view. Neither had any objections, and nobody had any questions. They were all simply too fatigued to care too much. As the meeting ended and people went their separate ways, Leah followed Dan as he stiffly walked away the cramps in his muscles. Both sipped on hot coffee as they walked, until Leah broke the silence. "You should take it easy at your age," she said innocently, intentionally poking the bear for her own amusement. "And you should be in school at your age," he retorted. "So looks like neither will be happening." Fair enough, thought Leah, happy that she managed to force some humor out of him despite how lame it was. Stopping to light a cigarette, he turned to the girl and assessed her. She was dirty, her hair was shiny with grease, and he couldn't be sure which one of them was emanating the unpleasant stale body odor. It was probably him, he reckoned. Deciding that he should make some kind of "I'm proud of you" speech, he tried to find the words, but nothing came. He settled on telling her to get some rest before she took over sentry duty before first light. With a nod, she turned to leave, and he called her back. "You've got something on your vest," he said, pointing his index finger at her chest. Instinctively, she looked down, only to be rewarded with the obvious and annoying finger poking in the nose. Dan accompanied the gesture with a comedy boop, and earned himself a look somewhere between "Dad, you're so embarrassing," and "Do that again and I will cut you." Pleased that he had elicited some humor in her response, Dan smiled at her and watched her walk away. Smoking in satisfied silence, he checked his watch to calculate if he could grab a couple of hours' sleep himself before he took over watch in the night. At first light, both Dan and Leah, him at the rear and her at the head of the convoy, readied themselves for action. Sunset and sunrise, and the hour either side of both. The times for peak alertness, ingrained in Dan from a young age and passed on through tradition to Leah for any sentry duty at night. When the sun was fully clear, Dan relaxed slightly to see that Mitch had joined him in a defensive position some distance away from the vehicle. The instinct was more thoroughly ingrained in Mitch than any of the others. Nodding to him, Dan sat up to make himself slightly more comfortable as Mitch and Neil began to unload the loud and ungainly motorbikes from their straps on the side of the fuel tanker. They hadn't used them for days at a time, and this was the first scouting mission they would be required for since Belgium. That seemed like weeks ago to Dan. He watched as both men organized their equipment and rode away at low revs to maintain a lower noise profile. Shortly afterwards, Jack arrived with a fresh mug of coffee to relieve him. "Blessings of God to you, friend," he said quietly in his broad Belfast accent, a perfect mimic of the same first words he had ever said to Dan. "And to you, Jack, thanks," he replied as he took the drink. "You go on now and get some rest," Jack said as he climbed stiffly up on a wheel to reach the top of the vehicle. "I'll take it from here," he finished as he settled himself down with his favorite large pump-action shotgun across his knees. At this stage, neither Dan nor Leah needed to find a quiet spot to sleep. They were both so tired that they climbed into the back of their armored truck, wriggled their way into sleeping bags in full clothing, and were unconscious in minutes. Neither stirred at all, until the high-pitched engine noise of the two-stroke Hondas cut into Dan's brain. He sat up, joints creaking and cracking as he moved, waking Leah as he did so. She sat up too, only far quicker and without the percussive fanfare brought on by age and a life of pushing physical limits, and both looked at their watches simultaneously. They had slept for just over 5 hours, which was days short of what they needed, but more than ample to carry on. As they climbed out of the back of the truck, Dan cursed silently as he saw Henry duck back behind the larger of their vehicles, only to reappear bearing 2 hot drinks. Dan's annoyance, while exasperated by their tiredness, was becoming almost intolerable. The boy was obsessed with him, with her, with both of them. Henry wanted nothing more than for the pair of them to like him, just not the dog. Henry reckoned Ash still recalled what he tasted like, and wasn't eager to repeat the incident. A groan escaped Dan's mouth, and he was quietly chided by the girl. "He's only trying to help," she said under her breath, as the grinning boy strode purposefully toward them. "Don't be an arse." Having been left insufficient time to answer her before the excited arrival of their coffee, he turned a wan smile towards Henry and thanked him for the drink, before walking away as slowly as he could bear to be polite. This had the added bonus of giving him a small snippet of awkward and forced conversation, as the boy, complete with his wispy chin sprouting the fuzz of which he seemed pathetically proud, tried to engage Leah in some casual conversation. "Don't be an arse," he quietly mocked her in a whiny voice as he walked, earning a patented ears-up, head-cocked response from Ash, who had rushed to his side as soon as the door of the truck opened. "Don't you start on me, too," he told the perplexed dog. Glancing back, he saw that Leah, in spite of what he thought, was interacting with Henry and wore the most curious look on her face as she brushed a strand of greasy and unruly hair behind her ear. Good God, he thought. She's actually flirting with him. On reflection, it wasn't that unexpected. He was almost 16, she was nearing 14, and although they were either side of proper when it came to the age of consent, he guessed that Henry was her only real contemporary in the group. The thought of having to have the talk with her was more worrying than a firefight. But he was sure Marie could deal with that. Marie. As soon as he thought of her, he realized that he callously hadn't given her a single thought since he woke. Crucifying himself for being heartless and trying to blame the tiredness, he promised himself to see her as soon as he had spoken with the returning rangers. Flicking away the end of the cigarette as though it was the remnants of his guilt, he strode purposefully towards the resting motorbikes as the 2 dust-covered men recovered from time in the saddle. Placing both hands on the small of his back and leaning back to push out his gut, Neil looked suddenly like a travel-stained Santa Claus. The ridiculous posture made Dan's face crack into a smile, which gave Neil a perfect opening. "You do well to look happy, old boy," he said, greeting him cheerfully in his favorite go-to character, the wing commander. "Barracks ready for inspection," he crowed with a mocking salute. Too tired to spar with Neil, Dan turned and raised an eyebrow to Mitch. The soldier shrugged as though to imply that the entertainment wasn't that good, so he had no concerns with the channel being switched over. Campsite, wooden buildings, compost toilets, geothermic eco stuff, according to him, Mitch indicated Neil, who still grinned at Dan in character. Set in a valley. Thick woodland on 2 sides, topography is impossible to assault by vehicle, and the main entrance is easily defended. If we were blocked in, we'd still have 100 evac routes on foot. The succinct report of the defensive capabilities of the site gave Dan little cause to complain. If Mitch said it was safe, then it was safe. If Neil said it could sustain them temporarily, then he trusted that assessment too. "How far?" Dan asked. Sensing that the comedy act was no longer drawing a crowd, Neil answered him straight. "Hour on the bikes. Fairly easy roads." Dan nodded. "Any other movement?" he asked, turning to Mitch. "Nothing I've seen. A few deserted towns with no signs of life, and what looks to be a fire burning out in the city," Mitch said. "City?" Dan asked, looking around as though he would suddenly see something he hadn't noticed before. "Dijon," Neil informed him. "The place is probably less than an hour southwest of it." Squinting his eyes as though that would help him recall the geography, Dan felt as though they had just driven in circles around Europe for a week. They still had hundreds of miles to cover until they had a hope of getting to the south coast without making a straight run on the major roads. Pushing that thought away, he thanked the 2 men and asked them to stow the bikes before taking a break. "We move in 1 hour," he told them, eager to be in place before the sun began to set on another wasted day. He moved off, clicking his fingers out of autonomous habit and bringing the loping dog close to his leg. He walked along the convoy, which seemed to have vomited people and equipment from everywhere he looked. He told the people to pack up their belongings, to be ready to move soon, and he did it wearing a relaxed smile and trying to exude the air of easy self-competence and reliability that they used to know. He tried to recall the feelings of excitement, of adventure, of happiness he felt to be undertaking the journey they had followed him on. His smile grew as he made jokes with some, reassured others, and wound his way circuitously to the large canvas-backed truck where the resting Marie was propped up on a throne of ration-pack boxes padded out with coats and sleeping bags. She watched his approach as he climbed aboard and pointedly ignored Sierra's presence. When those two were fully rested, she thought to herself, they could have a fight over the color of grass. He was followed with a total lack of dignity by Ash, who only gained the tail step of the truck on his second scrambling attempt. Kneeling down at her side, he took her hand in his and stroked it as he looked up at her. "You're so melodramatic," she said, mocking him and looking over his shoulder to pat the arm of her makeshift seat and invite the dog to spring over the obstructions to settle down awkwardly at her left hand. Dan fought down the Game of Thrones reference burning on his tongue and let out a small laugh at her levity. Of everyone he had ever met, she was the only person to have never taken him seriously. Many others had little or no respect for him, but her mocking was different. It was as though she knew the world was a terrible, dark place, but she refused to let that pessimism infect her. She laughed at him whenever he tried to be serious, and when he tried to show concern, she mocked him further for overacting the part. "How are you feeling?" he said to her, moving past being the butt of her joke. "I fainted," she said seriously. "I didn't lose a kidney. I'm fine." He smiled at her lightheartedness again and told her they had to pack up and move for maybe 2 hours at the most. From behind him, the protests started in full surround sound from Kate, Sierra, and 2 others who were watching the show. But Marie silenced them all with a raised hand to allow Dan to finish. "Neil and Mitch have found somewhere we can rest up for a week. I want to be there before sundown." "Okay," she said simply. He rose and kissed her tenderly on the forehead, prompting a retching noise from her. "Do your teeth before I see you next," she said from behind the hand covering her mouth. Backing away, he had to admit she had a point. Walking to the head of the convoy with Ash back at his heel, he looked to the dog. "New low, eh, boy?" he said to the dog, as though he expected a response. "Yep," he said, as though the conversation were actually happening 2 ways. "It's definitely a new low when you can smell yourself." 3 hours later, the convoy halted a quarter of a mile back from the big wooden entrance under guard, while Dan and Leah went forward on foot with 4-legged backup. Trees and grass had overgrown what looked like an impressive entrance. It had the feel of one of those traditional carpentry places Dan had seen in an almost forgotten past, all wooden pegs, hand tools, and no metal fixings. The entrance was at the end of a wide track with steeply sloped banks on both sides as it entered into the bowl of a valley. Thick woodland ahead loomed menacingly, but Dan had that hunter's eye for terrain and knew it would serve well. He had been told that the stream running from high on his left went through the campsite and into a lake further down the green bowl of land they were in. Daydreaming, he couldn't understand why this place, which must have been a prime spot for a settlement when such naturally occurring things mattered so much, had not grown into at least some grand residence. The answer was only hinted at when Leah pointed to a faded sign bearing a striking red logo. Unable to read or decipher the lettering, he could only assume that there was some lottery grant or historical trust money involved in preserving this place. A cobbled courtyard opened up to become a kind of village square, and at the far end of it stood the single largest building. Stables, large lean-to sheds, and a series of smaller buildings surrounded it. They seemed to have walked into an overgrown set from some medieval film, and the results could not have been better. The majority of the buildings were weatherproof and dry. There was a central well on top of the running stream Dan could hear, and thoughts of the fresh game in the woodland made this place look like a haven in their backwards world without the modern accoutrement to which they had all become so debilitatingly reliant upon. Systematically, they worked through every building until taking a full perimeter, one half-sphere each, until they met at the site's furthest end where the stream ran downhill to the lake. Swinging the carbine behind his back and seeming to signify to Leah that she could stand down, he took a packet of cigarettes from the battered pouch which had been custom-made and stitched onto the front of his vest. Lighting up and inhaling deeply, he was transported back months to when he stood looking out over another lake with a young girl wearing brightly colored clothing and making pretty notes with her new pens as she ate sweets. "What do you think then, kid?" he asked Leah. She sighed as though she too reminisced about the more simplistic past before she answered. "Perfect location. Approach is easily ambushed, but is the only vehicle access. Emergency exits are situated here, here, and here," she said in passable mockery of Neil impersonating an air hostess as she stuck out one hip and made gestures with her hands at the surrounding woodland before continuing. "Cut back some of the trees for better line of sight on the approach, and we can sit tight here for weeks. The bonus, obviously, is that there are no fresh bodies to burn," she finished, finally letting him know they were both in mind of the same shared conversation. "Yeah, but do you like it?" he asked with a smile. "It'll do," she said, smiling back. Kicking the habit. For the last 3 days and nights, Steve had sat in his uncomfortable bed experiencing a maelstrom of emotions and sensations. His temperature never remained consistent. He raged from fever-like sweats to such deep cold that he felt as though his very bones were frozen. The only consistent feeling was the agonizing pain in his head and the sensation of having swallowed acid and having to feel it burn slowly through every part of him. His reluctant nurse, Jan, spent most of the time with him, and although he seemed happy enough to talk in a quiet voice when spoken to, Steve was rarely in a lucid state to converse. The big South African just sat still and quiet, reading book after book. His body rejected most of the food he was given, and as a result, the drip had to stay in his arm. The only temporary reprieve was when he was given minute doses of opiates to ease the pain. In truth, the injuries were no longer that severe, but the amount of morphine he had been given was way over the recommended dosage. Steve was in withdrawal and suffering badly. Jan knew this and told him so, but Steve vehemently denied being addicted. He saw it as an insult, an affront to his character. He was a career military pilot, so how could he be an addict? He pushed the thoughts away and lapsed back into a waking coma of pain and shivering. Every day he was half carried to the toilet to clean himself and rid his skin of the dry film of sweat. His hands were still so unsteady that he allowed his constant shadow to trim the gray beard he had sprouted. He couldn't bear the thought of someone else holding a razor to his skin, so he left the short beard and accepted a close haircut to match. Wiping the condensation from the cold mirror, he saw his reflection again, and the shock of his resemblance to a prisoner of war brought him low once again. Small snippets of information kept coming to him about the others. They had been mostly separated and given work details among the other protected civilians. The camp seemed to have close to 600 or 700 people inside, and at least 1 in 10 were wearing some form of uniform as a kind of semi-legitimate militia. Ostensibly, they were there to guard Richards' survivors, but the guards seemed mostly to be looking inwards, not for outside threats. Jan worked him hard, never showing an ounce of sympathy for the pain he was in or the wretched feelings he had. Every time the physiotherapy he had to endure daily became too painful and he curled up in a fetal position, his nurse would berate him like a child and tell him he was weak, that he was giving up, that if he didn't want to get better, then there was no point in him surviving the helicopter crash. As Steve lay back on his bed, out of breath and sweating through exertion of his weak and atrophied muscles, Jan sat close and asked him why he thought he survived. "The crash?" he asked, confused by the change of direction. "All of it. The sickness, the shit you went through after that, the crash. Why didn't you die at any point before now?" Jan asked seriously. Unsure if the questions were rhetorical, Steve remained silent until the answers were given to him. "Because you weren't meant to," came the eventual solution. "None of those times were your time. So there's still something important you need to do with your life. Otherwise, why did fate spare you?" The concept of fate and faith being raised by the big, scarred man in front of him, who seemed simultaneously capable of a destructive rage and providing genuine care, threw him again and sent his mind into a tailspin that no pilot could have recovered from. On his small walks around the immediate vicinity, he saw that the sprawling camp had been extended using buildings, shipping containers, and some heavy-duty fencing. Guard posts had been erected at intervals, and everything seemed to be running like clockwork. A mirthless smile appeared on Steve's face as he thought about Richards. This was the exact kind of order he wanted. The fact that it was achieved through fear and force wouldn't bother him, just so long as there was order. Auschwitz was probably a very orderly place too, he thought soberingly. As the days wore on and his strength and senses returned him to piecemeal, he began to orchestrate a plan. Whether that plan would work yet, he had no idea. He only knew that he would not live under tyranny, and he owed it to everyone he knew, and those he didn't yet know, to free them from under Richards's blanket of fear and compliance. He would take control of Camp Bloody Bravo somehow, and by God he would turn it into what it should be. Free. Which meant that Richards had to go. Nature's Bounty. Dan's happy band of adventurers settled in quickly, probably more to do with their eagerness to be stationary for more than a few hours than for any other reason. Huts were claimed, beds hastily made, and orders given to make the small settlement home for a short while. Dan walked the perimeter again with Mitch, making mental preparations for some work they needed to do to increase their defenses. Turning on Dan with red-ringed eyes, Mitch had clearly wound himself up to say something that Dan may not like. Too tired to argue and too trusting of Mitch to have to show dominance, he asked him what was on his mind. "How long are we going to stay here?" he blurted out. "Not sure," Dan replied. "A week?" Mitch kicked at a rock and kept his eyes on the ground, making Dan feel like he disagreed with him but wasn't sure how to say what he wanted to. "Just spit it out, man," Dan said, although as kindly as he could manage. "It needs to be longer," he snapped back. "Everyone is fucked, and not just the civvies, but our blades too." Dan had to smile at that. It had been a while since he'd heard someone refer to their fighting strength as blades. While Dan was inclined to agree, he sensed that there was more on Mitch's mind. "So how long do we wait?" he asked gently. "A month? 2? By which time we'll be wading through shitty weather and snow trying to head south. We're already out of summertime. The nights are getting longer and the temperature drops every day. How long will we last on the road in winter, for fuck's sake?" he finished, more in exasperation than anger. His voice had risen higher as he spoke, and realizing that he had just inadvertently shouted Mitch down, he shrank himself back to his normal size and tried to put the anger and frustration back in its box. "You're right," he said by way of a weak apology. "But so am I. So what's the compromise?" Brushing off the hostility and confrontation instantly, Mitch had his answer loaded and ready to fire. 2 weeks, he said. Long enough to recoup, but not so long that people get comfortable and decide to live in a mud hut forever. Fixing him with a look, Dan simply agreed. Dropping his cigarette end on the dirt and grinding his boot onto it, he walked away without another word. Watching the conversation from a short distance away, Two people emerged from their hiding places of minding their own business and made their way towards Mitch. "Well?" asked Kate. 2 weeks, Mitch replied, seeing Kate bite her lip and consider what they could achieve in that time. "It'll have to do," said Neil, joining the small circle. "Any longer and Marie will be struggling, and I don't want to be carting her around when she starts looking really pregnant." "In that case," Mitch said, turning his tired face to look at Neil, "I need your help getting a sentry post up." Kate watched the two men walk away, discussing the necessary building materials, and let out a sigh, which was somewhere between exhaustion and desperation. 2 weeks was more than enough to patch everyone up and get them properly rested. But delaying any longer would mean they may be stuck in medieval France for a whole winter, which would mean a death sentence for Marie and the baby. If that happened, Dan would fall apart. If Dan fell apart, she had very little hope of any of them surviving to see another summer. A day and a half later, things in their small village looked very different. The vehicles had been carefully backed into the small square, with the tallest blocking the entrance and facing outwards. The main truck was too big to reverse fully inside, so it acted as an obstacle and a sentry post in one. A small shelter had been erected on the roof of the cab, with all the comforts required of a discerning night sentry: water heater, seat, high-powered rifle, and snacks. Kate had claimed a section of the main hall as a field hospital and laid out all her gear. Marie was propped up in a corner and instructed to do nothing but rest, as every other member of the group, with no exceptions, was given a health check. Dan tried to decline, but was instructed that in no uncertain terms would he be exempt. "Who's the highest authority on a warship?" Kate asked him when he told her he was fine. The question caught him off guard, and he sensed that the logic of the conversation was already predicted, so that he lost with whatever counter-argument he raised. "The ship's doctor," he answered grudgingly. "Exactly," Kate said, looking proud to have won, but a little disappointed to have achieved victory without a fight. "So, Captain," she said with heavy sarcasm, "sit your arse down and let me check you out." As she fussed over him, he asked her quietly about Marie. He had tried to ask the woman herself, only to be unceremoniously ejected from the hall so she could be violently sick. "The morning sickness is crippling her, but it's supposed to be the worst around this time. She's starting to show more, and I doubt that our little road trip has helped with that. She's dehydrated and tired, but I can fix that." She stayed silent for a while as she calculated his heart rate with her fingers and a stethoscope. "As for the long-term fix," she said when she had finished, "I'm afraid that's on you." As if the burden was not already painfully apparent, the reminder sent Dan back out to his duties with a heavy heart. Pausing to light a cigarette in the crowded square, the smell of coffee touched something inside him and inspired him to hunt down the source until his need for caffeine was satisfied. Much to his disappointment, the source rested with Henry. Having made his entrance, he could hardly ignore the boy and leave, so he accepted a cup and tried to play nice. Henry was tinkering with a wind-up radio in the desperate hope of finding something other than static. An excruciating few seconds of watching the boy turn the dial millimeter by millimeter threatened to shatter his pretense of being able to tolerate him. Unable to contain either his patience or his irrational temper any longer, Dan rose to leave. As he began to walk away, with Ash loping to flank him, the static broke, rewarding the boy's perseverance with a flash of garbled speech. It was unintelligible, not spoken in English, but it was undoubtedly words. Dan froze and spun back to the boy, who wore a look of such triumphant horror that he sparked both pride and an immense annoyance in the older man. Brushing away the latter, Dan strode back towards him with such purpose that Henry almost spilled from his seat on a log, thinking that Dan may have finally cracked and would go for him again. "What was the frequency?" Dan snapped at him. Dumbstruck by the radio and Dan speaking to him, he simply opened and closed his mouth without a single word escaping. "The frequency?" Dan said again, more patiently this time. "What was the frequency?" Flustered, Henry picked up the radio, which still wavered between static and silence, and squinted at the dial. "Just after 600, he stammered. Spinning away, Dan scanned the faces of those people he could see, looking for Neil. As much as he wanted to bawl his name, the panic that would cause in others was not worth the excitement, so he kept quiet. Eventually finding him close to the entrance, he told him what Henry had found. "Could be a voice loop from before," Neil offered, by way of being a devil's advocate, only to reverse that opinion as he worked through the logic. "But nothing would still have power to be broadcasting without someone looking after it," he said, moving his hands as he thought through the possibilities. "If it was anything but static, it must be manned. Think about that. Even if something had an indefinite power source like solar and was set to repeat a recorded loop, by now it would have needed cleaning or maintenance to keep going." He looked at Dan with excitement, not knowing that the two men had very different ideas. "We need to hear what they're saying," Dan said. Just as Neil began to agree, Dan continued. "I want to know who they are, where they are, and what their capabilities are. I need to know if they are a threat." The disappointment on Neil's face was sadly evident. His friend, the person still alive that he had known for the longest time, the man capable of such heroic compassion and empathy for others, was broken. Everywhere he looked, he saw danger. Every person they met was an invader to him. He understood that some of the paranoia, in fact most of it, was completely justifiable. But the sadness Neil felt for him then was incredible. Dan simply couldn't allow himself to think that there was anyone good left in the world. Thinking how best to explain this to him, Neil gently offered an alternative suggestion. "Or we could find out what they're saying, where they are, who they are, and try to understand why they're broadcasting a message," he said. "Remember when we left a message the first time? That brought us Leah." He left the last comment hanging heavily on Dan's conscience. The dirty face with its scruffy beard, which was starting to show gray in patches, looked up at him past the angry scar running down over his left eye. Before he could ask, Neil anticipated and answered. "We need a big metal aerial, somewhere up high." And when Dan opened his mouth to ask where, the older man simply pointed behind his shoulder to the hills in the distance. Sitting proudly on top was a string of large metal pylons. "Climb up one of those and I reckon you'll get the message." Dan stared forlornly into the distance. He didn't know whether it was the prospect of heights or the risk of disappointment which twisted his insides more. Summer holiday. The gear was packed, repacked, and carefully placed into the Land Rover like jigsaw pieces to achieve the most efficient fit. Precious diesel was siphoned into the extra tank on the roof, and spare tires were checked for pressure. They could afford no more delays, unless they wanted to be testing the off-roader's ability to traverse a snow-covered continent. Melissa was adamant that she was done running. Lexi suspected that she had made friends in the group who had convinced her to stay, but most of them curiously avoided the newcomers.
How are you? Driving to work because today in the morning I have to talk with someone in college, my coworker in the past. And now I'm driving to my work. How about you?
So it is my turn to send you a message. I hope that you'll have a wonderful time and a beautiful afternoon and morning and day, and that everything is going to work out for the best for you. Take care of yourself and enjoy your sunny day. Take care. Bye bye. Oh, it's a beautiful blue sky, and the sun seems to be so very bright in your place. Take care. Bye bye.
Simon, by way of association, she incorrectly assumed, was included in that avoidance. Dressed in a mismatch of different colors now, both Paul and Lexi had found themselves foregoing their usual black attire. There seemed little point in continuing the trend anyway. Chris remained sullen and hostile, despite his usual nature, and Lexi suspected that the loss of Melissa was stinging him on a more personal level. She recalled the gossip of the house that the two spent a lot of time together on the farm after he and Anna split, but the relevance of that seemed insignificant now. Either way, having a grumpy adult in the back seat of an already cramped vehicle on a long journey asking if they were there yet seemed less than inviting. Lexi asked Simon directly why he didn't seem to play much of a part in his own group, but the big man deftly turned the question away in such a manner that she was left even less sure of the answer. The most she could gather was that he seemed to be in charge before he met Dan, but then when he came back as the sole survivor, something changed. She couldn't be certain if it was the group's feelings towards him or Simon himself, but something had definitely changed. If he was planning on joining them to escape, then that was okay with her. He was a capable and very reassuring man to have around. If he was joining them to cleanse some debt, then that gave her cause for concern. Regardless of mood, and with almost no ceremony whatsoever, they rose early and squeezed into the truck to drive east without a word. Lexi liked the Land Rover, but she could never understand how such a big vehicle could force a difficult choice. The driver had to either forego using their right hand for much other than holding the wheel still, or wind down the window to allow elbow room. The choice between awkward steering and constant draft was an uneasy one to make, but Lexi, having the smallest frame by far, made her the best choice for driver. Paul sat behind her with a map on his knees and his rifle propped next to him, whereas Lexi placed her own on the dash. Simon sat in the passenger seat with a shotgun between his knees, and Chris sat behind him, looking out the window in silence. That silence infected the cabin for most of the 4 hours it took them to reach the outskirts of the capital. From the large encircling motorway, which was usually at a standstill with too many cars all trying to get to the same place, they could see the haze of destruction resting above London, where the imagined cloud of smog would be. Without a word, they all stopped to stare at the brooding place, like it was some mythical dark zone that they were forbidden to enter. Lexi saw Simon stifle an involuntary shudder. Whether it was about his imagination at what horrors had happened there when it happened, or whether it was the country dwellers' inherent fear of built-up areas, she didn't know. They drove on, weaving through more and more obstacles now as they pushed further into the population centers. As one, and without any words of caution, all 4 occupants became more alert now that they were feeling surrounded by more concrete than they were used to. Perhaps it was a form of evolution, Lexi thought, like wild animals instinctively knowing to watch the skies for predators. Were they evolving to keep themselves safe through instinct? Or more likely, were they simply all too aware of the risk they faced from other people? Pushing onwards and being forced to make a few minor detours, they reached their goal in the early afternoon, to find a scene from a disaster movie. French Connection. After 4 days of living the natural lifestyle, moods had returned to something resembling normal. No longer were everyone's eyes rimmed red. No longer did people fall asleep mid-conversation through sheer exhaustion. Clothes were washed and dried, meals were taken in relative comfort, and people tended to their small needs which weren't addressed when they were on the road. Dan surveyed the quietly busy scene beneath him as he stood watch, feeling curiously like an outsider as he witnessed the normal goings-on of his group. Thanks largely to the boxes of ration packs taken from storage in the military lines, their food needs were more than met, with each 24-hour pack containing more calories than most of them needed in 3 days. They were designed to keep soldiers in the field fighting fit with maximum efficiency. The novelty of the packs never seemed to wear off, and it seemed to Dan that every person he saw had a foil packet of something edible. Being more partial to having a sweet tooth, He had already emptied all the boiled sweets, nuts, dehydrated fruit, and cereal bars from a half-dozen packs, and crammed the treats into every available space in his personal kit. He could never stand being hungry, and said as much to Mitch, who was sitting beside him in the sentry post. "Mr. and Mrs. Death's 3 little boys," Mitch said, looking at Dan to see if he was following the train of thought. Smiling, he held up his hand and counted off 1 finger at a time as they both spoke in unison. "Cold, wet, and bloody hungry," they chorused, before lapsing back into an amused, comfortable silence. Mitch was there to take over mid-morning, so Dan could no longer delay his venture to the mast. He was both dreading and avoiding it, while simultaneously excited to know if others had built something as good as they had at home. Home. He still thought of it as home, even though he'd come to realize that the chances of making it back there were on the slim side. His home, whether he could articulate it or not, was wherever Marie, Leah, and Ash were. If that happened to be sitting on top of an army truck, eating vegetarian all-day breakfast from a foil packet, and surrounded by what were effectively mud huts, then that was just fine. Only it wasn't. If they didn't find answers to questions they barely understood within a few months, then nothing would be fine ever again. "Right," he said, his back painfully cracking as he stood. "Back by sundown. ERV 5 miles down the road if the shit hits the fan. If I'm not back by morning, then come and rescue me." He hardly needed to reiterate the instructions to Mitch on what to do in the event of something unexpected, but he felt better for saying it all the same. He had argued adamantly against taking Henry to the mast, despite it being his discovery initially, and opted to go alone, as he didn't want to take away another gun from their small camp. The motorbike should get him most of the way there, and as long as he didn't fall off, then he should easily be back before nightfall. Climbing down to find Ash had preempted him and was waiting at his feet when he landed. He told him he had to stay with Leah today. He was rewarded with a concerned look of misunderstanding, which incidentally was the same look when the dog's hopes for food were raised, but he followed obediently all the same. Finding her lounging on boxes of ration packs with her feet up and a nail file gently sculpting the tips of her fingers came as no great surprise, as Dan had come to accept that she was, after all, a girl. Pointing first at Ash and then to Leah, he gave simple instructions. "You, stay." Ash glanced once at Leah, then both looked back to Dan in unison. "And keep the dog with you. I'll be back before dark," he said as he turned to leave. "Hilarious as ever," came the muttered sarcasm aimed at the back of his head. Neil had already prepared a bike for him, and he said goodbye to Marie, who mildly scolded him for being sobby. A hint of seriousness crept into her voice, edged with concern as she asked him, "Are we going to catch a break soon?" Smiling to reassure her, he kissed her and promised they would. Soon. He took the wind-up radio and the length of wire which Neil had given him instructions on how to use, and he set off at an easy pace down the road. Maybe the relaxed atmosphere of being stationary for recuperation dulled his senses slightly, but instead of his usual paranoid alertness, he allowed himself to enjoy the ride. He was in an area of soft, green, rolling hills, which in the absence of people was truly beautiful. By midday, he had reached the nearest piece of road to the high bluff where the metal museum piece stood proudly. As he nursed the bike carefully through the overgrown grass up the slope, he wondered absent-mindedly how long it would stand before nature showed its slow-moving might and reduced it back to the raw materials from which it was made. A long time, he guessed. But still, it was an inevitability that every trace of their feats of engineering would become relics. Maybe one day people would look at the remnants of the 7 wonders and seek answers in ancient texts about their origins. That musing killed his blissful mood as the thought of human survival hit him hard in the gut. He concentrated on pushing on, of reaching this goal so he could move on to the next. Have something to fix, have somewhere to be, have a reason to get up in the morning and live. That's how he had lived his life before it all went to shit. And he didn't like to admit that he preferred it now to how it used to be. Marie's words echoed back to him as he struggled higher still. You were broken before all this happened, so it fixed you in a way. It gave you a purpose again. He didn't know if it made him a bad person or not, nor did he really give it enough thought to care. But he had enjoyed the last months more than most of the years before. No point in dwelling on it, he told himself. It was what it was, and he had a job to do. Eventually, the bike would go no further through the long grass, and after he had turned off the engine, which had stalled, and pulled all of the foliage from between the spokes of the front wheel, he rested the bike down and trudged the last part on foot. Neil's instructions were simple. Stick the wire in the radio and put the other part as high up as he could reach. Neil didn't know of Dan's fear of heights, or his healthy respect for the force of gravity, as he preferred to call it, but the wire he had given him was 30 feet if it was an inch. Thanks, Neil, you bastard, Dan complained to himself. Bracing one foot into a joint of two heavy pieces of metal, he began to climb hand over hand until he reached the ring of sharp spikes and barbed wire designed to stop foolish people attempting to scale the pylon. Hanging on tightly, he looped the end of the wire, which he had tucked in the top of his vest, over the spikes a few times before casting the rest down to the ground. Neil had sounded confident when he told Dan this, but now that Dan was the one perched precariously 20 feet from the ground, he suddenly had doubts. Shaking, inch by inch, Dan returned himself to his natural state of having both feet on the ground. Eager to be away from the scary high thing, Dan picked up the radio and pulled back the heavy-duty sticky tape attached to the back of it so he could force the wire into the aerial socket. Taping it back into place, he spun the winding handle a dozen times and settled down to fine-tune the dial. Static. He carried on turning the dial millimeter by millimeter. At 603.5 kilohertz medium wave, the static broke, and he could hear a faint voice. Without doubt, a human voice was broadcasting on the other end of that frequency somewhere. In his excitement to hear the words, he held the speaker next to his ear until it occurred to him to turn up the volume. He cranked it to 11 and listened. As Neil suspected, it was a looped recording, but that didn't put Dan off, as the chances of something automated still broadcasting after all that time was impossibly small. The words were coming through mostly, but that wasn't the problem. Of all the skills he had, mastery of the French language was not among them. In fact, of all their group, none of them spoke French other than bits and pieces forced into their brains from their school years, which for most were a distant past. As best he could, Dan wrote down the message as he listened to the words loop over and over. He wrote down everything he could make out, and when he looked at his notes, it seemed to be a puzzle calling to him, pleading for him to understand and mocking his ignorance. Tous les survivants, nous, sécurité et la famille, notre imprenable et résisté, génération, nous sommes, nous vivons, les vies, nous, sanctuaire, for sud. Sitting back and lighting a cigarette, he began to logically unwind the clues on his paper. Survivants is survivors, he said aloud to himself as he sketched a guessed translation next to each word. Security, obviously, he muttered as he worked on. After 5 minutes, he read his best estimation of the message back to himself. Survivors, security, family, impregnable, resist, generations, life, sanctuary, fort, south. With a pleased smile, he read his notes aloud once more. Then his elation evaporated. As pleased as he was at having figured out a few words of French, he still had little or no clue what the message actually meant. It could be a call to survivors offering sanctuary. It could be a threat to outsiders to stay away. It could be a bloody advertising campaign miraculously still playing so many months after the store closed down permanently. Either way, it made little difference, because he had no indication of where the damn place was. He had no idea how far radio waves could travel, but at a guess it must be hundreds of miles, which narrowed it down to, well, France. Deflated, he packed up the radio and decided to leave the makeshift aerial booster in situ. He was convinced it had done nothing to help anyway. Hoping that someone else could piece together more than he could, he stowed his notepad and heaved his small pack back on to retrieve his bike and return to the others. The underground movement. As Steve gained more strength, his daily excursions around the camp became longer and reached further. He was being helped along on his crutches, and twice saw people he knew. One didn't see him, he was sure, and the other just looked terrified at the guard next to her and turned away. He couldn't remember her name, but thought she worked on the gardens. Maybe she was from the group they rescued from the shipping containers. Maybe she wasn't. His memory was terrible since the crash. The trauma, being in and out of consciousness for days on end, and his subsequent reliance on opiates had hazed the past badly for him. He would poke fun at Dan for not learning all the names of the people they lived with, knowing that it bugged him and made him feel a little shallow. But now he was faced with the same prospect. There was only so much room inside a person's head, and right now his was too messed up to recall the small details. Looking around at the way everyone moved in small groups, some escorted by armed soldiers, made him mindful that this was not a safe place. This was hostile territory. He was living behind enemy lines, and he had to portray no threat to them. Concentrating on appearing weak while he exercised, he started to take note of everything he saw. Within a week, he had almost a half-square mile mentally mapped out, all the while asking innocuous questions about which building were used for what purpose. He was sure to keep his information gathering as innocent as possible. Although he was certain of Jan's lack of loyalty to the cause, they were always followed by at least one armed guard. For his own safety, obviously. "Am I going to get moved back into the normal population?" he asked his nurse, who was painfully moving his leg during a therapy session. "I haven't been told anything," he answered, as he often did when Steve questioned him about the camp. Steve was learning to take the man literally and phrase his questions as such. "What were you told when you were assigned to fix me up?" he phrased deliberately. "To fix you up," came the gruff answer, followed by a smile touching the corners of his mouth at his own humor. A conversation with Jan was like a game of chess. Thinking about it, Jan saw no harm in elaborating on his answer. "Fix you up, don't tell you anything, don't let you wander off," he said simply. "And I have to report on your progress," he finished, putting a sarcastic emphasis on the last word. "My progress?" Steve asked innocently. "Yep," came the reply before he paused to push on Steve's leg with more effort, earning the pilot a stab of pain. "He wants to know what you were saying about him." He was obviously Richards, and from the way Jan said it, he was clearly no friend to the South African. The arrogance and insecurity of Richards would be laughable if only he didn't have a small army to impose his will on others. Steve was certain that if left unchallenged, Richards would soon drop the pretense and announce himself as dictator. In any normal society, not that things were normal anywhere nowadays, declaration of martial law was seen as extreme. It was to admit that the bounds of acceptable society, of decent human behavior, had broken down, and that a crushing show of force was required to re-establish those boundaries. The use of an armed people's militia, in Steve's opinion, was now a definite must for any group. But the militarization of the population and the classifications of type of worker just felt horribly oppressive. It was an occupation, he decided. That was the best way to describe the somber feeling in the camp. They were protected, sheltered, and fed, but they weren't free. Given the choice, he believed that most people would choose risk and hunger if the price for them was their own liberty. Bringing himself back to the moment, he pressed his advantage and directly asked Jan his opinion on Richards. Staring blankly back at him, giving nothing away, Steve didn't know whether he would answer or run straight to the man himself to report. "The man's an arsehole," Jan said simply with a shrug, as though his opinion mattered little. Relief washed over Steve. Without this man on side, he had no hope of gaining any further assistance. "He makes lots of pretty speeches about protecting people. But everyone is only here because he commands more guns. Jan leaned closer now, dropping his voice further. I was happy before he turned up, and 3 of my friends died before we all gave up and all lined up like sheep to be told where to go and what to do. He leaned back as though the conspiracy could be detected through the walls before adding, so yeah, I'd like to see him gone, but I don't see how that's going to happen. Steve also leaned back, although slowly to avoid aggravating his battered body, before responding. Information is the key, he said. Know your enemy, he quoted, waiting for agreement. Know your enemy and learn about his favorite sport, Jan said with a smile. Steve frowned, earning a rare chuckle from his companion. It's a quote from The Art of War, Steve said, embarrassed at having to explain his jest. I know, replied Jan with a broad smile. You were quoting Sun Tzu, but I was quoting Nelson Mandela, and I think the man might have got this right too. Totally confused now, Steve sat and listened as it was explained to him. When he finally understood, he saw that the sport approach might be the best, but possibly the riskiest idea he'd heard in a long time. Le tunnel sur les marches. Nobody spoke much as they rolled at a steady speed along the deserted and badly overgrown motorways of the desolate southeast of England. Forced to travel carefully down the middle of the 3 concrete lanes, the tall weeds sprouting from the central reservation occasionally brushed against their offside windows, just as the encroaching tree line of the near side forced them away from the hard shoulder. Sporadic clusters of long abandoned wrecks littered the gray and green monotony, giving brief pauses as they assessed the potential dangers before pushing through. Ordinarily, the journey would have taken them half a day without having to compete for space on Britain's overcrowded roads. But having to be ever alert to the danger of ambush, as well as vehicle-killing potholes caused by the weather and a total lack of repairs, made that trek significantly more ponderous. Every obstacle forced them to stop and watch as they defended themselves all around to any attack. Then, they would gingerly press on until the torturous sound of off-road tires complaining over pitted concrete bore into their brains. At that pace, they eventually turned off the bigger roads and into the once busy cross-channel train terminal. I remember this place, Lexi spoke wistfully from the front passenger seat. My dad drove us to France years ago. It didn't look like this, though, she said, indicating the ruin and disrepair of the place which once saw thousands of cars making the international crossing every day. Nobody answered, not through impoliteness, but more from the air of rhetoric with which she made the distant recollection. People rarely spoke about life before. It was just easier not to think about it. More cars were abandoned here, the filthy insides of the windows an indication of a once living cargo. They drove on past, leaving the forgotten souls undisturbed. Not having brightly lit arrows to follow and yellow-vested staff to guide their path, finding the tunnel entrance took time. Driving slowly down a long concrete ramp, a scene of such chaos was unveiled that all 4 occupants of the car were struck open-mouthed at the carnage which lay below them. It seemed that one last train had arrived from the continent. One ill-fated locomotive had seared through the signs bidding them bienvenue, and without a coherent driver to slow their progress, had careened straight through the terminal and collapsed in a concertina effect straight into the very end of the lines. Instantly derailed and forced along by the thousands of tons of freight and passenger cars, the train had struck the thick walls and seemingly imploded. Remains of cars were spilled grotesquely across a wide area as the occupants of the train who had been sitting in their vehicles were spewed violently out, and the 4 looking on could only begin to imagine the horror of such a crash for anyone left alive. Simon's thoughts turned to the possibility of any survivors, not from the crash, that seemed perversely unlikely, but for anyone immune to the whatever it was. They would have surely known what was coming, would have known that they were in for a brutal ending. Putting himself in that situation, he wondered if he would feel some small amusement at the irony of such a final chapter. Looking at the wreckage once more, he decided that he probably wouldn't. Finding their way onto the tracks without suffering a 6-foot drop from the platform took much longer, but eventually they were bouncing uncomfortably along the gravel tracks towards the looming black hole in front of them. Not one word was spoken until the light in the cabin was snuffed out instantly as they went down the slight incline into subterranean uncertainty. With just a strained sigh from Paul, they began their crossing. While you were gone. 2 hours after she watched Dan ride away looking like an overgrown child on a bike too small for him, Leah was walking the perimeter of their temporary camp for want of anything better to do. She told herself it was training, that she was learning to work as a pair with Ash, just as Dan did. But if she was honest with herself, she was actually playing. She shouldn't be playing, though, she told herself. That was for kids, and she didn't have the luxury of playing anymore. Still, training was allowed to be enjoyable, wasn't it? She took cover behind a large tree, peered around and waved Ash off to her right, watching out of the corner of her eye as the big gray dog slunk low and silent across the ground. Moving position again, she gave a single low whistle to call him to her side. Within seconds he joined her, nudging her leg once to let her know he was there. She had barely heard him move until he was close. Repeating this pattern, they moved deeper into the woodland than she had ventured before, and just as she became aware of that fact, a flash of movement ahead snatched her attention. Sinking low and raising the gun for real, she flicked the fire selector to semi-automatic. Sensing that the mood had changed, Ash dropped into a crouch and sniffed the air. Realizing that the wind was blowing from directly behind her, she knew how they had moved so close to something undetected. Silent and downwind, whatever had moved was once again imperceptible. Wait, she told herself. It was most probably just an animal, but the feeling in her gut made her more cautious. Creeping forward as quietly as possible, she noticed a slight movement ahead again, accompanied instantly by a low growl from beside her. She sank lower, holding out a hand to quiet the dog, and watched. In a small clearing, maybe 50 paces ahead through the trees, she saw colors. Not the autumn colors of woodland, not the warm yellowing of the leaves, or the vibrant reds nature treated them to every year, but something distinctly and unnervingly man-made. Holding her breath, she turned her head slightly from side to side to look for a better vantage point. Seeing the fallen log to her left, she crept slowly back from the more exposed bluff she was on and sank low to watch after setting Ash down to lie still. Wishing she could take credit for her four-legged companion's skills, she marveled at how he stared intently towards the possible threat without making another sound. Slowly, moving every muscle with infinite care, she eased the carbine's sight up to her eye and began to scan the woodland. After a few seconds, she found the source of the unnatural color and let the rest of the scene come into focus. Sitting still on a fallen tree, not dissimilar to her own hiding spot, was a man. A bearded man, wearing green and brown, as though he wanted to blend in, but the woolly hat on his head bore a red and yellow emblem. That was the flash of color she had seen when the man turned his head. He seemed unconcerned, like he hadn't realized he was being watched. So Leah was happy to stay and see how things panned out. She was due on watch in an hour, so if she wasn't back in time, then all kinds of merry hell would be raised in camp. After another minute of watching, she was glad of her patience. In the foreground of her scope, much closer than the man she was watching, another person dressed in drag clothing shifted their position as they leaned against a tree. Stifling a gasp in her throat, she forced herself to be calm as he was close enough to hear her. Behind her, Ash still stared intently ahead, not that she could turn to look, but hadn't made a single sound. Whoever those two people were, they were being very quiet for a reason. Slowly inching herself away from the log, she turned her head to look in the direction she had come from. She saw nothing to concern her, but nonetheless made sure that her escape route was clear to the best of her knowledge. Shuffling back centimeter by centimeter, Her body shook with the effort of being quiet, even when she desperately needed to open up her lungs and breathe deeply. Judging that she had moved enough, she rose slowly and walked as carefully as she could, nodding for Ash to follow. Dropping onto slightly lower ground, she reckoned she had put enough distance between them and quickened her pace. Another 100 paces, and her nerve broke. She sped up into a run as fast as her own safety would allow across broken ground littered with tree roots. Ash kept pace effortlessly as she burst into the camp to find most people already assembled by the gates. There was a visitor. Neil was on watch when the lone wanderer came into his sight. Raising a quiet alarm resulted in him being joined by Mitch only seconds later, as both watched the approaching figure through telescopic sights. By the build and the pinch of the waistline above the hips, Neil guessed that the unexpected visitor was female, and by all indications from the silhouette before him, nicely put together at that. She walked steadily, not too fast or too slow, with her arms out to the sides. As she came closer, Mitch spoke to him without raising his eye from the rifle. "Female, mid-30s, he stated. Neil could see that well enough for himself. She was wearing tight jeans and a t-shirt which didn't quite meet the leather belt she wore. At 100 paces, just before Mitch was about to issue a challenge, she stopped. Keeping her arms out to her sides, she performed a slow circle, showing the watching sentries that she was unarmed. Turning around a second time for good luck, she continued her methodical approach to the gates. Standing and slowly loading around into the chamber of his rifle, Mitch watched as the metallic sounds echoed down to her. The message was clear. She had come far enough. "Bonjour, je suis Christine," she called out in a curiously deep voice for such a slim woman. Mitch's language skills were limited to only English and foul, but thought he recognized enough to believe that the woman had just said hello and was called Christine. Happy with his cultured and very metropolitan experience, he jumped down to further the international working relationship by searching her at gunpoint. She complied readily enough, although she exuded an air of boredom as she responded to the sign language and grunted orders from Mitch. Neil watched on, part mesmerized by the appearance of the woman who he would describe as striking more than attractive, and part worried about an encounter with another group. His experience of others over the last in recent history had left him cynical at best. When Mitch was satisfied that the woman really was unarmed, he lowered his weapon and asked her what she wanted. As a typical Brit abroad, he was sure to speak loudly and slowly, as though that would aid her understanding. She looked at him, her eyes boring through him and making him feel distinctly uncomfortable. There was something of a feline manner about the way she looked at him. The way she moved made him mindful of something predatory, and he decided that he didn't trust her. "What do you want?" he said again, loud and slow. "Talk," she said with a heavy accent, unsure of the word. She shrugged and rattled off a sentence in rapid-fire French, never taking her eyes off him or dropping the slightly amused look that a cat would give a mouse. She tried again, pointing at Mitch. "Français," she said, mimicking his unintentionally condescending tone. Exasperated by the lack of understanding, she shrugged and dropped her arms to her sides petulantly. "I come again," she said as she turned and walked away. "In English." They could only watch as her hips snaked away down the long approach road. At that point, both men were snapped out of their voyeurism by a shout from inside the camp. Mitch ran back inside to see Leah jogging into the square. "Two men in the woods," she said succinctly, barely out of breath. "Just sitting still." Ash sat obediently and looked up at the pair, unsure if the conversation would turn to him with praise. His head switched from soldier to teenager as though he was watching a tennis match as they took turns to speak. "We just had a woman turn up here," he told the girl. "She didn't speak English and just left. Too much of a coincidence that they aren't together." Questions were fired from both sides, questioning whether the waiting men in the woods were armed, and Leah gave her responses before asking her own questions about the woman. All around them a buzz of excitement was growing as the others gossiped about what they had heard and what it could mean. Leah became very aware of the small crowd gathering, and she twitched her head for Mitch to walk away with her. "So what do we do?" she asked in a hushed tone when out of earshot of the others. "Nothing, until Dan gets back," Mitch replied dutifully. "But we need to prep." 2-minute drill? He asked her with eyebrows raised. 2-minute drill? Yes, she replied after a moment's thought. This was something they had worked on with the whole group. When instructed, they were all to be ready to leave within 2 minutes. That meant that everything they weren't immediately using was to be packed up and ready to go at any time. It meant sleeping with your boots on. It meant raising the panic levels considerably, but it reduced the chances of them being caught with their collective trousers down. Orders were given, extra guards posted, and the group busied themselves packing all their gear away. Just as Leah was preparing to lay some noise traps in the woods with Jimmy, the sound of a motorbike engine pierced the sky. The enemy within. Eventually, Steve was summoned to see the Major. He instantly swallowed his involuntary scoff at the self-rewarded promotion in a hierarchy which no longer held any semblance of credibility. He had no legitimate lieutenants or captains, nor did he answer to any colonels or generals. He was a self-styled military dictator, and no floral display of humility or service could hide that fact. Still, Steve thought, play along. Play the weakling, don't be a threat, and keep your head down. If Richards saw him as a broken and beaten man, then he could not be forced to play a role in the subjugation of the occupied citizens, could not be bullied or threatened into trying to fly again, not that he had any hopes of recovering the strength required to do so. He had to appear weak, and although he had been preparing for this summons for days now, he still made a show of seeming flustered and confused. Although his wits were restored, he knew that his body was not. He couldn't hope to fight his way out of an ambush conducted by babies firing water pistols at this point, and he had to show the world for all he was worth that he was finished. To allow even a flash of his inner fire to show through his eyes could spell his death, and if he died, then his hopes for realizing the plan he was hatching would die with him. He shook. He twitched as he spoke, and seemed to lose his focus. He seemed racked by sudden pains in his head and body, and he could barely walk unaided. If Richard saw him as just a half-soaked cripple, then he would not try to use him and would not need to kill him. He had to act it out perfectly. The guard who had brought the summons was preempted by the news which was brought by a runner to the window at the back of his damp and breezy room. Jan's eyes shot up and fixed on Steve as he heard the gentle knock, knock, knock at the window before the unknown courier vanished into the sprawling camp. The agreed signal, whispered among the underground rebels over mealtimes, that Richards was planning to bring Steve to him. The two nodded to each other, both aware of what they had to do now. Steve lay back and half curled up, feigning the pains that racked him as his body cried out for more morphine. Jan sat in the chair and silently ignored his pretend pain. Moments later, the door opened without warning, and an armed man strode in. He had the look of a soldier, in that he carried a rifle and wore a green camouflage uniform shirt and trousers, but the ill-disciplined and wild look he wore showed no signs of training. This man wanted to be on the winning side, and he enjoyed the power it afforded him over others. Had he been living somewhere else when it happened, then he would have become a follower of the King of Wales or Bronson. He was a bully, nothing more. "Get up," he growled at Steve, who only responded with a whimper and curled up into a tighter ball. "The Major wants to see you. Now!" He offered no more words, merely glared at Jan, until with an annoyed sigh, he carefully folded the page in the book he was reading and placed it down before getting up and manhandling Steve upright. He was sure to treat him without any obvious sign of care or respect, like he was just doing the job he was given by watching over the sick man until he was told to do something else. "On your feet, you bastard," Jan grumbled, without any real malice, as he forced Steve up into a sitting position, bringing him his crutches. Still, he had to half-hold him as he made his slow progress in leaving the cabin. Young was sure to wrap him in an extra blanket to show just how much he felt the cold, even though the temperature of early autumn was still warm. All part of the act. Twice Steve feigned a stumble, and twice he had to be helped back up to continue on his way to the meeting. Richards was not a man who liked to be kept waiting, and every minute Steve wasted getting there was likely to be a minute less spent in the company of the man, as he no doubt had a schedule he intended to stick to. Eventually, he found himself at the bottom of the stone steps which were originally a library or museum, he guessed, the top of which sprouted a sandbagged embrasure complete with crew-served machine gun. Whatever the steps once led to, they were now the way into the headquarters of the camp commander. Already Steve had heard the reference made to Richards as the commander, as much as people called him Major, and he guessed the distinction was one that the man would happily allow, as it afforded him the highest rank in people's eyes. There was no higher power than him. That was the message, said loud and clear. Sweating and exhausted from making the short journey seem infinitely more difficult than it truly was, Steve collapsed onto a hard wooden bench where he was told to wait. His chest heaved to recover the expended energy, and although he had pretended to be physically broken, he had to admit to himself that the truth was not a quantum leap away from the imagination. Heavy, dark oak double doors, which stretched halfway to the tall ceiling, were thrown open, and out strode the magnanimous Major Richards, resplendent in his uniformed glory, and flanked by the ever-present personal guard. This personal guard, if met under different circumstances, would raise hilarity of epic proportions. Dressed in camouflage as all the other troops, these men stood out because they wore their combat trousers tucked into high boots, sported a bright red sash tied about their right arms, and wore full-face balaclavas like terrorists filming a propaganda video. Maybe next they planned some thunderbolts on their collars. Again, Steve had to fight to keep a laugh inside at the stupidity of how seriously this man took himself. All comedy aside, he wondered just how hard a job it would be to overthrow this dictator. Heavy machine guns guarding his headquarters against the general populace, as well as anonymous guards flanking his every step, indicated a man who felt threatened. A man who felt comfortable and safe would likely surround himself with beautiful female assistants, not faceless armed men. Forcing his head back into the game, Steve concentrated on taking in every detail he could while acting like a broken man who offered no threat. With a glance at the guard who had summoned him, Richards nodded into the office with his chin and walked back inside after offering a single withering glance at the man he once thought would be his right-hand man. Sitting behind his desk and producing a bottle with 2 crystal glasses, he was blithely unaware that he had tried the same forced camaraderie with Steve before. It had failed then, too. Pouring 2 ungenerous measures into the glasses as Steve was dumped unforgivingly into the chair opposite, he slid one over to him without a word. Playing the character well, Steve reached for the glass with a shaking hand and drank desperately, as though he sought any temporary reprieve from the pain he felt. Coughing and choking on the fierce liquid, he wiped his mouth and leaned back in the chair, waiting. Richards sipped his own drink, and then swirled the contents in small circular motions as he looked intensely at the bottom of the glass. He stopped and looked directly at Steve. "You caused a great deal of disappointment," he said icily. "Not that any of it matters anymore." He held eye contact with Steve a second past it feeling uncomfortable. Smiling his false smile, he rose from his seat and waved a regal glass-filled hand at the window and the sprawling population center spilling out as far as the eye could see. "We've accomplished a great deal without your help, and you should feel lucky. If you had done what you did now instead of then, it could be viewed as treason. The punishment for treason is death." Steve's eyes widened at the revelation. The man had casually reintroduced capital punishment, demonstrating that he held the power of life and death and wielded that power over the people like a spoiled child with a stick. Satisfied that he had elicited a reaction of fear, which he misread in Steve's expression, He went on with a well-rehearsed speech about their achievements in rescuing people and the protection he offered the world now. His vitriol extended deep into his own visions for a strong, united future. The sheer depths of the man's depravity were becoming clear to Steve. He was the worst kind of lunatic alive, a fanatic. A powerful man so consumed by his own ideas that he would never be able to see how hated, how power-hungry and crazed he had become. He had brought back the death penalty to a desperately depleted population with no way of knowing if the human race could be propagated. He ruled with fear and violence to force people who previously counted themselves as free and lucky to work and fortify his compound. He put them to work in the fields, farming to feed his growing army. He treated disobedience as treason. There was nothing more dangerous, Steve thought, than a man with power over others who wholly believed that he was the only one with the foresight to shape the future. Finishing his podium speech, Richards sat down in his chair, still wearing his ridiculous mask of the benevolent master. He saw Steve looking at him in horror, and his own ego made him interpret that as pure fear. And why shouldn't this man feel fear? He stole from him. He made him look foolish and weak. He disappointed him. Still, it wasn't hard to find him. Who else was flying around in a helicopter? It took only a few months for his scouts to report back with the location of their home, a prison of all ghastly places. And after that, it was a simple matter to send in his best spies and then arrive in overwhelming force and take it all away from him. Those he had selected for questioning had yielded a variety of different information. The fact that their leader and 20 others had left a short time before and not returned irked him considerably. He told himself he would have liked to meet this Dan character, to see if he stood up to all the things he had heard about him. If the stories were true, then this was a man who would surely see his vision of a united future. He would even have been worthy of a high-ranking position, which would obviously have helped integrate the rest of the group under his rule. If he objected, or lacked the foresight to join him, then the virtuous opponent would have made a fine adversary, and his eventual execution would have the same effect on the dissident members of his flock. He sipped his drink again, staring coldly at the man who had embarrassed him once. "Luckily for you, I'm feeling generous," he said, leaning back and half expecting thanks. "Besides, executing an unwell man would hardly offer much entertainment. Now, be gone. I'm tired of your company." A nod was raised to one of the balaclava-clad guards, and Steve was aggressively hoisted from his seat and sent back out into the hallway, where Richards's voice echoed out to him. "Rest assured I want to speak to you again when you're sufficiently healed. Everyone must earn their keep here." Being so unceremoniously bundled from the grand office offered him a snapshot of a desk he had not seen when he entered. Behind the ornate wood, he saw a young man so elegantly groomed that he seemed almost feminine. The immaculately coiffed hair couldn't hide the red-ringed eyes which burned intensely. Another strand to the unfolding scheme fell into place for Steve at that moment. The waiting guards chivied him and Jan back to their isolation in silence. When he collapsed breathlessly onto his bed, he grabbed the nurse's arm and held tight. "I promise you one thing," he said through gritted teeth. "That madman has to die." Priorities. It was unfair for Dan to have implied any failing in the others. In fact, after he had calmed down from hearing the news, he recognized that he would have done exactly as they had done. Everything except let the woman leave. Now they had an unknown group in the area with no communication, who obviously had knowledge of the ground and some form of skill set. He would have liked to ask the woman himself, probably loudly and slowly in English, but he couldn't because they had simply let her go. Recognizing that he might have caused some offense by his reaction, he proceeded to give a few orders which he was certain would have been preempted. "Put everyone on 2-minute drills," he instructed his small council of advisors. "Done," said Mitch. "And double the guard," Dan said. "Done," said Mitch again. The woods, he tried. Guards posted at the rear. Done, chimed in Leah. And Jimmy's put up some noise traps with string and tin cans. Good, Dan thought. They had done everything he would have done, and they had done it quickly. Allowing them to feel proud of themselves for having performed the tasks before being told would lift their spirits, he knew. It was as close as he could come at the time to giving praise, but he was just too damn fearful of others. He felt too vulnerable. Did you get anything from the radio? Neil asked him. Digging into a pouch on the front of his vest for the pad of paper he had used caused a flurry of activity as Ash leapt up from his resting spot, thinking that something edible was being produced. Seeing it was just a piece of paper, he settled back down to wait for the next opportunity. As he read his own rough translations aloud, the others listened intently. Survivors, security, family, impregnable, resist, generations, life, sanctuary, fort, south. Silence greeted him, followed by a flurry of questions, none of which he could hear clearly as all the others were speaking. Holding up both hands to ward off the storm, he answered them all at once. I don't know what it means. I don't know where it is, and I didn't get it all. It could be a warning to stay away. It could be an invitation to join them, or it could lead to nothing. Right now, we need to focus on the immediate and worry about this afterwards. Leah, Neil, Mitch, with me, please. With that, he walked out of the hut and into the square. His chosen companions knew him well enough by this point to wait until he had lit a cigarette before asking anything else. If I'm being honest with myself, the message sounds hopeful. He let that sink in and looked at the three pairs of eyes in front of him before he went on. But the main problem is that we don't have a clue where this place is until we get a stronger signal. It says south, and that's the direction we need to go. The problem with getting a stronger signal is that one of us has to travel at least a day away from here to try again. And now that we have company, then that seems unlikely. I'll go, said Neil, launching into a defense before the challenges were made. Look, you three are soldiers, and I'm an old git who fixes engines. You're needed here more than I am right now. No, said Dan. Thank you, mate. But that's exactly the reason you need to be with the group. I'll go, but not until we've figured out what that woman wants. Mitch's face colored slightly as he instantly regretted his adolescent description of the visitor to Dan. So what? We just wait for them to come back? Leah asked, annoyed at the prospect of inaction. Yes, said Dan, almost challenging her to push back. Fine, she said, conveying anything but fine with her tone and glancing at her watch and walking away. I'm due on watch. Ah, they grew up so fast, Mitch said sarcastically as she stomped away. They do when you give them an automatic rifle when they turn 13, Dan replied as he snapped out his cigarette and turned towards the woods. After the next 5 days spent on high alert, expecting some form of attack, nerves began to fray once again. Their soldiers were becoming exhausted again, having to do double the hours as sentries. As Dan sat with Marie, who never missed an opportunity to point out his lack of daily washing, she poked playfully at the scraggy mess of beard where it was turning white. She was trying to lighten his mood, and although it wasn't overtly working, at least she was distracting him from his brooding thoughts for a while. He was brooding, even more so when he saw that she was showing now. A noticeable bump swelled her belly, the physical manifestation of the very reason they started out on this fool's errand at all. He had to make a decision. Marie seemed to sense this too, and giving up on her attempts to annoy him into smiling, she told him what she was thinking. It's been almost a week and nothing has happened, she told him. Go and find out where this place is, or let one of the others go. But we can't just sit here waiting for something which might not happen. He thought about that, knowing that she was right, as she usually was, but looking for a way to rationalize it to himself other than just being bored of waiting. The reason for stopping at the camp had been to recuperate, which they had been doing until someone had strolled up to their front door. But packing up everyone and leaving without an objective seemed too much like a step backwards. Leaning over to give her a kiss, despite her squeals about the beard, he left to find the others. 30 minutes later, he was leaning over a large-scale map with Mitch and Leah. "The ERV needs to be some distance away," he said, as though Mitch needed a lesson in the skill which had been second nature for most of his life. Realizing that the explanation was more for Leah, he nodded along with Dan. "ERV-1? Here," Dan said, pinpointing a large bridge to the south. "Wait until daybreak on Monday, then fall back to ERV-2. That gave him a minimum of 3 days to catch up with them if they had cause to leave without him. "ERV-2? Here," he said, this time indicating a small settlement at least 30 miles to the south. It was far enough to not be in the same area, but not so far that it couldn't be reached on foot within the agreed 48-hour time limit. "After that, we look after ourselves," he finished lamely, breezing over the worst-case scenario. He straightened up, his back cracking in the process, and looked at the wider picture of the map. He had 3 days allocated to finding a better radio signal, one to travel southwest inland on the straightest and hopefully fastest roads, one to climb up high and get more of the message, and a day to travel back. Should he find the camp deserted in case the others had reason to leave, then he would turn around and head south to meet them at the bridge. If that failed, then they would fall back again, and if that then failed, he had no idea what would become of any of them. The planning of emergency rendezvous points before the group split was commonplace, but never had they found themselves planning for so many people over such a huge scale. The discussions of failure brought more than the usual amount of trepidation on the eve of something big. It brought fear this time. Dan had thought through his options and requirements, deciding that he had to use something more substantial than the motorbikes they brought for scouting. He would need to take additional fuel, equipment, and supplies if he was to be away for more than a night. That meant causing a huge stir in the camp by having to move the big truck out of the entrance and maneuver the most readily available of the smaller trucks they had. Despite his disappointment, getting the armored truck out would take too long and be too disruptive. So he reluctantly took the lightweight Army Land Rover, complete with its cracked windscreen where it had been perforated by bullets only hours after they had acquired it. He threw in his battered black rucksack, which had barely left his side in well over a year, as well as 2 jerry cans of diesel, a sleeping bag, and a whole slab of bullets. He liked to be sure. He was going alone. They all knew they couldn't face the loss of 2 guns while they were still on high alert. But the question remained of whether Ash would accompany him or not. 3 days without the dog would cause them both a fair amount of anxiety, but the pros and cons of leaving him with Leah were discussed. His early warning system could prove invaluable should anyone else decide to pay them a visit, and while it would be beneficial to Dan, he knew that he was effective enough alone. As much as it tore at him, he took his dog for a walk and told him he would have to stay behind. "It's not that I don't need you or want you," he told Ash as he stared back at him with no comprehension. "But you're needed more here. I'll be fine, and it'll only be for a few days." Getting no answer back, not that he expected one, he ground out his cigarette on the ground and walked back to the others, planning to leave at the following dawn. Dark, damp, and dangerous. 8 miles out to sea, over 100 feet below it, and almost 500 miles away from Dan's uncomfortable chat with his dog, 4 people sat quietly in their very slow-moving vehicle. The stress inside the truck was palpable, as much as the dank and foul air deep underground was slowly choking them. Without the small army of engineers and technicians required to keep the tunnel operating at peak efficiency as it had for over 20 years, the upkeep of such an astounding feat of engineering had been sorely neglected. The power to the air recirculation systems died long ago, and as a result, the quality of the air at the deepest section of the tunnel was desperately poor. They had decided, as logically as they could, to drive through the tunnel section the wrecked inbound train had used, hoping that would negate the chances of meeting any obstruction along the way which would force them to reverse for miles until they once again found daylight and fresh air. Obviously, the logic was sound insofar as when the crash first happened, but the risk of an obstacle which fell into place after was still on the cards. They all knew their reasoning was weak at best, but removing the chances of finding an outbound train completely blocking their route offered some small comfort. Not that comfort was a concept they could fathom at that point. The air was literally thick and had a quality unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. It was more of a taste than a smell, but it was undoubtedly unpleasant. Even through the closed windows with the air inside the car set to recirculate, their supply of oxygen was being slowly eroded. It started with the occasional cough, but now, after almost an hour underground, it was becoming more of a problem. At their current rate of travel, they would need nearly another hour to get clear on the other side. In another hour, they would probably all be too hypoxic to operate a vehicle. In another hour, they would probably all be well on the way to being dead. Riding solo. As he always did, Dan left with as little fuss as possible. Leah saw him off with Marie and Neil at her side. Dan held her tightly, worried that the woman carrying his child was still looking exhausted to the point of appearing almost gray in color. "What's your plan again?" Leah asked with professional curiosity. "Drop about 100 or so miles south," he began. "Kilometers," interrupted Leah, prompting a look of annoyance. "I'll drop about 200 kilometers south, and after that I'll cut away for higher ground," he answered sarcastically. Nodding her agreement at his plan, Leah still wore a look of confusion as she tried to formulate the equation between the metric and imperial measurement systems. 1.6 to 1, Ks to miles, Neil offered, seeing her struggling with the mathematics. Waving Dan off, Leah turned away to check her distance string calculations on her map. Driving away on his own, he felt suddenly so sure that he was being intensely watched, so much so that he actually began to scan the higher ground for any telltale signs of a watcher with an optic catching the rising sunlight. He saw nothing and told himself that he was just being paranoid. 2 minutes in the car on your own and you're already bloody talking to yourself. He laughed, realizing that the joke wasn't entirely inaccurate or funny. Sacrificing caution for speed, he turned off towards the larger roads, slowing only to snap off the plastic barrier as he drove through a toll gate before accelerating as hard as the uncomfortable truck could manage. Eyes alert and scanning as far ahead as he could manage, he relished being free and moving again. He often felt too contained before, but this was different. Getting away from home and ranging out even a day away took the edge off his uneasiness. But being totally nomadic was less enjoyable than he imagined. Perhaps he thought, being unburdened with the responsibility for the others, he would be happy just driving around with his dog and his guns. But then again, he pondered, he might just be as wild and unpredictable as some of the worst people they had met without the tether of a group to ground him, to keep him sane. Marie had told him once when they were talking about Rich overcoming the crippling post-traumatic stress disorder which left him so unable to integrate sometimes that his own situation was vastly different to most other people. Dan was broken before the world ended, and bizarrely the apocalypse fixed him, whereas it left most other people depressed and emotionally shattered. He was socially awkward at best, he knew that. But in truth, and in spite of all the disturbing events he had experienced since he found himself alone one morning, he had a purpose and a reason to stay alive. His purpose now was to put in at least 150 miles, or 240 kilometers for the sake of argument, before he cut away from the abandoned toll roads, further than he had originally decided. Cruising along at a comfortably sedate 50 miles an hour, he guessed he was making as much progress as he could hope for. Any higher speed made such a skull-piercing noise from the all-terrain tires that he found it impossible to concentrate on driving in a straight line. He passed only the occasional vehicle and avoided the small rest areas which were scattered intermittently every 10 kilometers or so. Logic dictated that anyone suffering illness would stop their vehicles, and he knew, even if they didn't at the time, that they would never rejoin the road. He carried on, unwilling to view the sad scenes of people dead in their cars. He cut away to the smaller roads after 2 hours, aiming the breezy truck towards a supermarket of such epic proportions that he couldn't imagine finding anything comparable back home. Approaching slowly, he slid from the driver's seat and stretched out his aching muscles. Restoring the ugly shotgun from the dash to the sheath on the back of his vest, he checked his weapons more out of obsessive compulsion over a technical need, and walked cautiously towards the large revolving glass doors. Giving an involuntary click of his fingers for ash to fall in, he silently cursed himself for not remembering his shadow was left far behind with the others. Forcing the unpowered door to grind around sufficiently to allow him in, he saw that the sealed portion was full of dead leaves, rotten away into mulch. Taking a second to understand what that meant, he realized that someone must have been here the last time the leaves had fallen from the trees. Knowing that nobody had used this door for almost a year was both creepy and reassuring. Taking a knee and listening intently, he heard no response to the small noises he had made getting inside. Still, he hadn't lived this long by being careless, he thought to himself. Creeping along aisle by aisle, he took note of where some bottles of water were for retrieval. The consumable food had rotted away long ago, leaving nothing but dried puddles and dirty marks where the insects had gorged themselves months ago. Finding the section he needed after passing large displays of refrigerators and garden furniture, he began to sift through the dust-covered books until he found what he wanted, a French to English dictionary. One of only 2 on the shelves, and right now worth its weight in gold to him. Not wanting to hang around in an exposed area without backup, he stuffed the dictionary into his vest and swung back via the water aisle to grab himself a plastic-wrapped brick of natural mineral water. A quick scan outside showed no cause for concern, so he threw his small haul back into the truck and drove out. Surviving in an exposed environment, especially alone, was more luck than judgment sometimes, and he felt lucky that nobody was there to take an interest in him. Deciding to push another hour inland, he settled back into the seat and eased the speedometer back up to almost 60 as he tried to ignore the tire noise. Setting his sights on the far hills, he drove along, eyes still alert to any potential danger. 3 hours' drive behind him, Mitch stood watch. He had an uneasy feeling, unbeknown to him the exact same feeling Dan had as he drove away. He was absolutely sure he was being watched. Just as he convinced himself that he was imagining it, the sound of the single shot echoed around the valley. At the exact same time, the bullet hit him straight in the chest, throwing him off the top of the truck and bringing the ground rushing up to his face with sickening force. Light at the end of the tunnel. It was more of a physical reaction than a conscious thought, some deeply ingrained survival instinct which took over and made his limbs operate the vehicle without the need for cognitive intervention. Simon was drowsy. He could barely speak coherently, let alone realize that he was slowly suffocating and suffering the dangerous side effects of a loss of oxygen to his brain. Simon's body, on the other hand, knew exactly what was going on. It couldn't articulate the fact that the fumes that deep in the tunnel were making the air almost unbreathable, or that the mix of gases there was toxic. But it knew that it was going to die if it stayed there. It didn't weigh up options or consider possible outcomes. It just reacted. It made his right foot press down harder on the throttle and pushed the speed up to a bone-shaking and painful speed. His body was unaware of the fact that 2 of the other occupants were complaining loudly about this, even less aware that the third passenger was unconscious. It just forced them all towards clean air and sunlight before they suffered worse than the fumes they were currently breathing in. Twice they bounced painfully over the rails and skimmed along the filthy concrete walls surrounding them as the headlights burned a bright white lance in front of them. Imperceptibly, the air quality changed. The dimmest hint of gray infected the inky black around them and grew like an insidious virus, slowly taking over every minute part of their subterranean world until they began to realize they were approaching the other side. Simon became more aware than he had been before. Not that he realized he was less aware at the time. It was more like the feeling of being drunk, but not knowing why or how. He tightened his grip, squeezed the steering wheel, and steeled his resolve to head directly for the light at the end of the ever-so-slight incline. Like some hideous interpretation of birth, the Land Rover burst into the sunlight and skidded to a stop on the gravel of the tracks. Throwing open the doors, they spilled out to suck in as much fresh air as they could possibly inhale. Lexi was the first to regain her senses fully. Dragging Chris from the car, she laid him on the ground and checked for signs of breathing, which, with great relief, she found easily. Rolling him over onto his side with his head in her lap, she just sat and rocked as the others breathed through their own problems. Trying to speak aloud, she choked and coughed uncontrollably. Clearing her throat, she tried again, this time in a strangely cracked voice which didn't sound like her own. "Welcome to France," she said with heavy sarcasm. Peace in solitude. Armed with his precious literature, Dan made good headway throughout the remainder of the day. Devoid of any recognizable sign of human life, the landscape he moved through became more undulating before the distant peaks became less distant. As the sun began to sink, he selected and cleared a small building to use as a shelter for the night. Finding a small slice of happiness in stretching his legs and only having his own wits and weapons to rely on, he made camp and ate a hot meal. On further consideration, he felt that the happiness and freedom may have more to do with not having the others relying on him. A stab of guilt hit him, soon brushed under the metaphorical carpet of his thoughts, and he focused on the job at hand. Nestling into his sleeping bag for the night, he soon missed the company of one of the group. As the evening temperatures became distinctly more autumnal, he wistfully imagined the heat that Ash would be radiating right now. As first light rose, so did Dan. The surprise at seeing his own breath misting in front of his face made him worry that autumn was further along than he feared, only for his mind to catch up and recognize that the drop in temperature was likely due to the significant rise in altitude. That elevated altitude was the sole reason he was here. Higher ground, and hopefully a stronger radio reception. Fueling himself for the day by cooking breakfast, he concentrated on the minute details of his routine. Open the plastic bag and ignore the written instructions. Place the foil packet containing his favorite all-day vegetarian breakfast inside and pour in a distinctly unmeasured amount of water, seal bag, and wait. Inside of the anticipated 30 seconds, he watched as the bag suddenly inflated and steam hissed from the minute vents where the seal wasn't perfect. Knowing that the sachet of chemicals was now reacting with the water and creating a fearsome heat, which in turn was being transferred to his breakfast, he sat back and glanced at his watch in order to count off the required 8 minutes. His patience broke just after 6, and he ate the mostly hot contents straight from the silver packet, ensuring he scraped it clean with the folding spork he kept in his vest. Licking the last remnants of food from the utensil, he dried it on his trousers and returned it to its place. Not very hygienic, he thought to himself, but smiled that there was nobody around to admonish him for his lack of decorum. Pushing the hot remnants of the rubbish aside from any potential prying eyes, he repacked his kit and stretched off in the chill morning air as he smoked. Taking the time to enjoy the nicotine now pumping around his body, he scanned the horizon for the best place to head for. A similar hill to last time, with a radio mast already in place, was the obvious choice, but he could see no easy way to reach the summit. He settled instead for the outside choice of a nearby tall building. Population centers had been something he had actively avoided for months now. It seemed to attract the wrong kind of attention. Like any survivor found there, would hold no interest in growing food, but instead would prefer a more piratical approach to gathering supplies. His confidence in having seen no sign of others for 24 hours led him to decide on the simple option of the nearby 4-story brick mausoleum. As he approached at low revs, he killed the engine to roll in silently as he swung the front of the truck around so as to be pointing towards escape should he need to depart in haste. A slow circle of the building gave him no cause for concern, and the discovery of an external metal staircase seemed just too easy. Maybe his luck had changed, but he realized he had thought that before. With a torturous noise, the rusted ladder squealed towards the ground when he pulled it. Fearing that the sound would have carried far, he took cover and watched a